welcome to the Turning Pages program brought to you by the Center for HBCU Research, Leadership, and Policy. My name is Melanie Carter, and I'm the Associate Provost and Director of the Center, and so pleased that you can join us today. We're really in for another, we think, informative and exciting session or episode, Turning Pages. We're here today with Dr. Jelani Favors. Dr. Favors is Vice President of the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute at UNCF. He is certainly one of the world's leading historians and scholars on HBCUs. Dr. Favors has been awarded major fellowships in support of his research that includes an appointment as a Humanities Writ Large Fellow at Duke University in 2013, and he was an inaugural recipient of the Mellon HBCU Fellowship at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke in 2016. Dr. Favors' most recent appointment includes leading the Center of Excellence for Social Justice. He's the founding director at North Carolina A&T, where he also served as the Henry E. Fry Distinguished Professor of History. So Dr. Favors is certainly an esteemed scholar and researcher, and we're really pleased to have him join us here today. Also, of course, he's a graduate of North Carolina A&T University, earning a BA in history with honors, as well as a master's and a doctoral degree in history, one in African American studies, and the master's and the PhD in history from the Ohio State University. So again, I'm so pleased to have Dr. Favors here and to talk about his great book, which we all love, Shelter in a Time of Storm. How Black Colleges Fostered Generations of Leadership and Activism. So again, welcome, Dr. Favors. We're
Thank
so
you.
pleased to see you today.
Thank you.
Looking forward to a great conversation. Any opening remarks about the work or about what you're doing now with UNCF before we get started with some of our questions?
Well, I'm excited to be in this position. As I told Dr. Lomax when he offered me the job here at the UNCF, there are a few brands that I respect more that have been around in supporting and advancing the legacy and mission of HBCUs and the UNCF, the United Negro College Fund. I know they try to get away from that and rebrand with UNCF, but I think of growing up and watching the telethons with so many, like we all did with Lou Rawls and others. And, just the UNCF was just one of those organizations that, race men and race women flock to support and advance our institutions. And so I'm really, really honored to be in this position. Not only that, but I'm really honored to lead an institute that has the namesake of Frederick Patterson, knowing all that he stood for, all that he fought for. Not just in the advancement of HBCUs as institutions, but in the advancement of Black people in this country, and to deconstruct segregation and racism. These are all things that he deeply, deeply cared about. So I'm really, really honored to be in this position now.
Wonderful, wonderful. I can't think of a better person because, again, I think understanding the history of our institutions and their importance in terms of shaping not only America, but certainly the higher ed ecosystem is extremely important. And so, therefore, your certainly understanding of that, I think, is critical and really does continue to situate the Frederick Patterson Institute well, which, again, we all rely upon the research that comes out of the Institute. I think I consult the website and your reports and all that every day almost. So again, we're looking forward to the continued great work that you will do there. So I'm going to move directly into the book because really on Turning Pages, we try to focus on the written work. And let me say again, Shelter in the Time of Storm is one of my favorite, of course, books. And I think really the way that you actually lay out your exploration by focusing on those Black colleges and also during a particular period of time, I think is so incredibly important and so rich. As I've shared with you before, I use this book. It's required in my History of Higher Education course, and we have students. I have students present on each of the chapters, and they do an amazing job. But really, again, your work, the foundation that you set for that analysis and consideration is really, really, really impressive. So let me just ask you the initial question, which is, what inspired you to write the book, and what key experiences or influences shaped the creation of it?
Sure. I was born and raised in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And growing up in North Carolina, you can turn around in any direction, throw a rock, and hit an HBCU. Black colleges have played a critical role in shaping the social, political, and economic landscape of that state in particular. Of course, they've done this on a broader scale in this country. But what that meant was that I was born and raised around people who cherish these institutions, right? Who made very clear how important these schools were. I met my wife in preschool at
Oh,
Winston-Salem State University. So
wow.
we first met. So from the very beginning, you
Hmm.
know, at A&T we have a statement: Aggie born, Aggie bred. When I die, I'll be Aggie dead. And from my birth, I have been deeply and profoundly impacted by the legacy of HBCUs. And having said that, I made a decision to originally I went to North Carolina Central University my freshman year in college, and then I transferred after my father suddenly passed. I wanted to be a little closer to home, so I came back to the Triad area and enrolled at A&T. And it was there I had professors who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. One of them was Dr. Margaret Dwight Barrett. After I left, she got married, so it's Dr. Dwight Margaret Barrett, but she was Dr. Margaret Dwight to me. But she had us as young historians doing and engaging in research. Um,
Hmm.
at a very young age. In fact, we had an academic conference called Missing Pages, which taught me to really understand how important and critical it is for historians to fill in these gaps, right? When you find them,
Hmm.
and all of that means that you have to become extremely well versed in the canon, right? You've got to know what other scholars and historians have said. Having said that, I left North Carolina A&T and went to grad school at Ohio State University, where I met Dr. Melanie Carter,
There you
who
go.
one of my first bosses with the minority advising program. And I also took a number of different classes while I was there. But I came there coming from A&T. We talk about student activism all the time, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Home of the A&T4 and the sit-ins and the Black Power movement was very much deeply entrenched in that institution. So I came to Ohio State really kind of ignorant, thinking that everything had been said and written about the history and legacy of HBCUs and activism. Like, what more needs to be said, right? We read Bill Chafe, those incredible books, Civilities and Civil Rights. Like, I thought that everybody knew how critically important these institutions had been in producing activists. And one of my mentors, Dr. William Nelson Jr., said, "Look, I think you should reconsider that. I think you're coming from A&T. I think you're well poised and well suited to take up and explore this issue." So he really kind of pushed me to continue that path of inquiry and that path of study, and looking at and examining HBCUs as these incubators for activism. And I took a class under Beverly Gordon, the great Dr. Beverly Gordon at Ohio State University, called the
My
History of.
advisor, my
Yeah.
dissertation advisor.
Oh, was she? I didn't know
Really?
that.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I took her class called the History of Black Education.
Yeah, part one and two.
Yeah.
I
Right.
took those two exactly.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
um, she introduced us into so many incredible works in the field. And I have two of them in my office. These are two of the most important books to me in my scholarship and my research. One was like a Bible to me when I was in studies,
It was
called
going to be Anderson.
James Anderson, The
Hmm.
History or the Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935. If you have not read this, if this is not in your library, it needs to be. He's an absolute titan in the field.
Hmm.
And of course, he examines these early histories. Then his other book and what's really great is that these folks have become, they were mentors to me then, even when they didn't know it, but then they became friends. And supporters of my work and my research. But this book, Their Highest Potential by Vanessa Siddle Walker, I found myself in these studies, right? Because one, Vanessa Siddle Walker book is on Caswell County, North Carolina. I'm born and raised not far from there. And then she does this sort of walkthrough where she's introducing you to these unknown voices, these unknown characters in the history of this county and showing how impactful this space was. And so already she's given me tools, right? Research tools that I wanted to employ in my own work. And then we read another book, which was just as impactful. And I never attempt to denigrate this scholar and his research, but it's called The White Architects of Black Education by William Watkins. And, in that book, he wrote that Black education invited Black students in particular to enter into society without disrupting it, without being, they were basically tools of compliance. And that just kind of struck me as odd, and it struck me quite honestly as wrong. That just wasn't what I was familiar with, because again, and not only that, but again, that class in general and my other courses that I was taking in African American studies and now into history, I just didn't see anything in the landscape of the scholarship that accurately described how do we get someone like Ella Baker. How do we actually produce someone like Mary McLeod Bethune or Diane Nash or Stokely Carmichael, or all the countless activists, Dr. King and so many, Howard Thurman. How do we explain these men and women and their development, their origins? Because what's the common denominator here? All of them were educated at HBCUs, and all of them had dedicated these careers to disrupting the social order. And I knew that couldn't have been by accident, right? There had to be something within these spaces that played a critical role in deeply fueling and directing the trajectory of these young men and young women who would reshape the political and social contours of our country. And so I set off to do that. By this time, I shifted into the history program from the African American Studies program. My dissertation advisor was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Hassan Jeffries, who he's an incredible scholar on the civil rights movement. He also happens to be a Morehouse man, so he'll always let you know that. And so he really also was really, really supportive in pushing me to move forward in this work. And so my dissertation was a comparative study of Tougaloo and Jackson State. And what that allowed me to do was to go to Mississippi, to be in the same, when you're in grad school, you don't have a huge budget, research budget. So you can't I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there. I wanted to get into a space that was very convenient for me to do a comparative study of a private institution and a public institution, both in the Deep South, both that had a legacy of producing student activism. And so I went down there, I did that study. The dissertation, of course, came out of it. And when I got back and I finished up and I graduated, it was Hassan who said, hey, you know what? I think you're really onto something. You should try to hit the home run and tell a much broader story, bringing in other institutions to tell the narrative, to paint the narrative of how HBCUs have been seedbeds for activism. And so the title of my dissertation was Shelter in the Time of Storms. I said it's kind of carried over, added 5 more schools to the narrative. And that's what ultimately became the book. So often, I thank Hassan for that push. Sometimes I also cuss him out for that push. as you know, as many scholars know, these projects can be labors of love.
Sure.
It was really, really challenging to have to travel to 7 different HBCUs, go to different archives to interview people, because again, the book is a longitudinal study. And so by the time I get to the 1920s, 1930s, I'm like, oh, some of these people might still be alive. I want to talk to them. So I did that. And the main primary source I consulted, which I think made a huge difference in the book, were these student newspapers. A lot of previous scholars had not really thoroughly explored the legacy of these voices that were emanating from these pages. Because, if you listen to them, they'll tell you, right? And by day, I'm talking about these historical characters that I encounter in the work. They literally would tell you, like, these are the classes I took. These are the people I engaged with, right? This environment that I'm in, it poured into my sense of self.
Hmm.
And so the story just kind of unfolded as I began to walk my way through these primary sources of these student newspapers, these memoirs, these minutes of meetings from board of trustee members and professors, these diaries. One of the most powerful primary source I encountered was Margaret Walker's diaries. Who was a professor at Jackson State University. I mean, just explosive. I mean, you get a sense of what it was like to be on the ground floor level as a movement for freedom is exploding all around them, whether it's the early civil rights movement, moving up to the modern civil rights movement. HBCUs were just absolute cauldrons of dissent and activism. And that was a far departure from what really had been described of them. And now let me say this before I shut up. And that is that I never intended to look at these institutions as and through romanticized rose-colored glasses. As I've often told people, HBCUs have been rife with colorism, classism, and paternalism, and all these other isms, which at various times have indeed maligned and curbed their ability to serve as active spaces for engagement for our students. But I knew that the story was more nuanced than that. The story was more complex than that. And I like to think that Shelter in a Time of Storm really played an important role in exposing how these interstitial spaces, classrooms, dormitories, young Black men and young Black women carving out these spaces as students, as faculty members, even as administrators, to advance the freedom dreams of Black people. And that's the story that it's not even the story that I wanted to tell. It's a story that was being told to me through these primary sources. And I'm glad that the book has continued to resonate with people as a critical source of understanding how HBCUs have indeed served as a shelter in a time of storm.
Absolutely. Well, I could, from what you just said, I have about 1,500 questions and comments, okay, that will take
Right,
us from now until
right,
Thanksgiving, but I'm not going to do that because, um, I mean, I think there's so much to unpack. But let me say this about something that all of what you said. One of the things that I think is so powerful about the book is that I have this, I always say, people know I say, that this whole thing about HBCUs and the secret sauce drives me crazy
mm,
because it's not a secret sauce.
no,
Okay. It is, as you've laid out in this book, I always say, this is an example. This is favors let us know this is what it is. It's not that we, sort of, we do love folks and love is operationalized in a variety of ways, but there
yeah,
are also some clear strategies and intention that went into this. This just didn't happen, right? Accidentally. It happened because of intention, strategy, um, experiences, understanding how important it was to thrive in an environment that was hostile to our own humanity. And I think you really do what I'm going to call empiricize anecdote, what some folks call anecdotal data. And
yeah,
so the really work that you did in the archives and those voices, illuminating and those voices and those perspectives, and really naming this communitas and the hidden
yeah,
or third curriculum, I think is extremely powerful. So I think everyone, I mean, when I think about Anderson's work, certainly I love James Anderson's work. I too took Beverly Gordon's courses, and she was my advisor, and also Vanessa Walker, who was also a mentor as well. Their work in terms of this, to me, this book certainly stands with them without a doubt, as Anderson says in his review or commentary about the book. But again, about Shelter in this Time of Storm. But so this work is really amazing. I think it really does provide us. And one of the things I want to ask you,
sure.
in addition, is what made you select the colleges you chose for the particular time periods?
Yeah,
I think that's really a conversation I had this week with students around. I love certainly ICY at the beginning, really understanding Philadelphia and so forth. But how did you select the colleges and place them in that in their chronological space?
but on a humorous note, that's always a point of contention.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because I've been blessed to go around and speak at a number of different
Hmm. Hmm.
institutions. Several of them, which of course didn't make it into the book by name, they're always like, "Well, why didn't you talk about South Carolina State? No,
Okay.
you should have talked about Prairie View.
Okay.
You should have
Okay.
talked
Sure.
about all these different." I mean, literally, There, over what 101
Sure.
HBCUs, and I could have plugged and played any of them into
Mm-hmm.
this scenario. I want to back up really quick before I get to
Sure.
that question about how I selected them, and again, tip my hat to Dr. William Nelson Jr., who was my professor. He was a political scientist and one of the founders, really, of the field of Black studies. But he taught political science and African American studies at Ohio State for a long time. And I'll never forget, doing that initial research, my master's thesis with him as my advisor. And he said, Mr. Favors, one thing I'm gonna give you a piece of advice. And
You sound like him too. Okay.
yeah, I know,
Okay.
right? So, but again, he's a political scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you can't put people in a test tube,
Uh-oh.
right? And that was his vote and his encouragement for me, to really lean into qualitative studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I was telling these stories, right, as these stories were coming to me from the research, I knew that I wanted to flesh out these very powerful narratives and voices from people that we didn't know. I didn't want to lean into this old and archaic tradition of, great man history, right? I didn't want to talk about Du Bois and Washington, right? As
Mm-hmm.
powerful and as important as they were in shaping this HBCU universe, there were so many other voices that I think were just as powerful. Fannie Jackson Coppin was just as powerful in
Mm-hmm.
shaping these early years and these formative years of HBCUs coming together. So that was very, very important for me to try to achieve that, and I think that I did achieve that in the narrative. Now, having said that, so again, the dissertation was Jackson State and Tougaloo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so Hassan said, look, you should go forth and you should add more. The Tougaloo chapter in that book was probably about at least 85% rewritten from my dissertation. Because one of the weaknesses I think in my dissertation with Tougaloo is that I didn't go through and really fill in the early years enough.
Okay.
And I knew I wanted to go back and really, really strengthen that. And so I chose Tougaloo as the second chapter in that book to really show what Black folks were going through in the pits of hell as the nadir is being
Yeah,
unleashed
that's right.
all around
Mm-hmm.
them, and racial violence is exploding, and Mississippi is really one of the epicenters for all of that. How did these institutions serve us in that regards? And one of the things that I think comes to light in that chapter is that, man, in spite of all that, where else could Black students be hearing exhortations from people like M.W. Witt, who was a former alumni who came back and spoke to them and literally gave a rallying cry for Black power in the
Absolutely.
80s, right? Saying, hey, y'all, we got to build, we got to get power, we got to, start empowering our community. I mean, so again, that notion of a shelter in a time of storm, I think really stood out in some of these characters like N.W. Witt that I was coming across, and the words and documents that he left us to really pull on. But I knew I wanted to start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So the Institute for Colored Youth was an obvious starting
Okay.
space for me. And when I could open up this story with the assassination of Octavius Catto, and it shows immediately what the blueprint is going to be, right? Is
Yes,
that
absolutely.
here's a Black professor,
Mm-hmm.
also an alumnus, who is assassinated on election day in
That's
Philadelphia
right. Mm-hmm.
for the role that he has played in
Mm-hmm.
producing students that have advocated for the 15th Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
If anything shows what these schools are going to be as it relates to incubators for activism, that's the narrative, that's the story. And again, you open up the primary sources, and you see people like Henry Highland Garnett coming to the school, Frederick Douglass coming to the school, the Matt Douglas is teaching at the school. So I mean, Fannie Jackson Coppin is there. So it just becomes a powerful template and blueprint for how these institutions are going to combine a first curriculum, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
They're teaching Latin and Greek and biology and
Mm-hmm.
religion and all the things that they're teaching at places like Harvard and Yale
Sure.
and all these other institutions. And they're not even technically a college,
That's right.
but they're giving college level work to these students.
Mm-hmm.
There's also this powerful second curriculum that emerges that, again, Melanie, I was very deliberate in making sure it wasn't hidden.
Right. Right. There you go. That's very good.
right?
Hmm.
I mean, they made no mistakes and or no attempts to try to cover
Sure,
the fact that this was very intentional work that they were
sure,
doing.
exactly.
So I wanted to start with ICY, and that happened, and I moved forward. Tougaloo was again an obvious. I wanted to go back and fill in that story.
Hmm.
I wanted to tell the story. I'm gonna come back to Bennett in just a second. I wanted to tell the story of the Deep South, and particularly um, the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Hmm.
And I knew the only way that I could really hammer that home was to make the focus of the next three chapters all about that.
All
So
about that.
Jackson State,
Hmm.
Alabama State, Southern University, all of them,
Hmm.
all three of those chapters focus on the Deep South
That's
state
right.
institutions during the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Why did I do that? Because again, a lot of the previous research suggested that state institutions in the Deep South were deeply compromised, and in many cases they were, right.
Hmm.
But many former scholars like Watkins and others argued that they were compromised to the point that no activism at all
Hmm.
within these spaces. And I mean, hell, Alabama State had
Oh yes.
had a powerful legacy. I mean, Joanne Robinson is teaching there,
Here you go.
right? I
Absolutely.
mean, so I mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
Thelma Fairbanks is teaching.
Hmm.
So I mean, you have all of these powerful women
Hmm.
who are educators and scholars within these spaces, and I know that they're playing a critical role in shaping the political consciousness of their students. So Jackson State and Southern and Alabama State really flesh out that narrative of the Deep South, 40s, 50s, early 60s, even going back to the 30s, showing how these institutions were springboards for, and indeed, as I continue to come back to, a shelter in a time
Hmm.
of all this lynching and overt racism and Jim Crow's become deeply crystallized at this particular point and embedded in American life. It was something going on within these spaces that would plant the seeds for a modern civil rights movement, even a direct action phase of it, where young Black students were going into spaces all their lives they've been told not to go. Right? Don't you go in there and mess with these white folks. Don't you go in there and overturn these laws. Right? You should be compliant. But yet, something about what they're being gifted with within these spaces is not letting them sit still as this is moving forward. And then the Black Power chapter. I mean, there were, as William Chafe argues, and I think accurately in his book Civilities and Civil Rights, looking at the Greensboro story. There were fewer places in America in the late 60s that were more active in the Black Power movement than Greensboro, North Carolina. And the catalyst and really the engine for all of that was the presence of North Carolina A&T. And so I knew, and people always ding me like, "Oh, wait, you're an Aggie, you went to A&T, you just want to talk about your alma mater." But I wanted to flesh out this story of, because again, we always talk about the sit-ins, right?
Hmm.
Even now at A&T, I think we have, and this is not to dismiss or negate the legacy of the sit-ins.
Hmm.
A&T has a very rich and beautiful story of during the Black Power era that needs to be understood.
Hmm.
So I wanted to tell that story. Now I want to back up to Bennett really quickly. Um, that chapter, and I've said this before in numerous places, but I think it's worth for your audience to hear. That chapter actually was supposed to be a chapter on Howard University. And in my second, it was supposed to be on Howard University during the New Negro era. And it was the only unwritten chapter that I had not finished, I hadn't even started on, when my second fellowship at Duke started in 2013. And I was literally preparing to head to DC to start the work and research at the Spingarn and to start that work while I was on fellowship there. And I was having lunch with one of my colleagues who actually happened to teach at Bennett, and she was wishing me well, and she stopped and she said, "You know what? Everybody talks about Howard. Nobody ever talks about Bennett."
Hmm.
I said, "You know what? You're right."
Hmm. Hmm.
As scholars, what are we trying to do? Again, missing
Sure.
pages. We want to fill in the gap. I want to do something new and fresh. And I made a conscious decision to make a pivot and say, you know what? I'm going to write about Bennett. It's going to save me some money. I don't
Hmm.
have
There you
to
go.
see.
Right.
I'm
That's right.
literally
Right here.
Greensboro's right here. My mama lived in Greensboro.
Okay. There you
I'm a
go.
fellowship at Duke. And so I made that decision to pivot And it's one of the best
It
choices
is a great
I've
chapter.
made ever in my professional career in terms of
Mm,
what the seeds of that article of that chapter I released as an article. It won the article of the year for the
wow.
North Carolina Historical Review. But more importantly, it gave me an opportunity to singularly focus on Black women
All right.
during one of the most radical periods politically for Black people in this country. And that, of course, was the new Negro era, right? This flourishing of political activism, this flourishing of liberalism within the Black community. I got a chance to get a bird's eye view of what young Black women, not only what they were thinking, but
Hmm.
how they were engaging, publicly engaging
Hmm.
ideas. And I love that chapter. I do. I mean, it's one of my
I love
favorite. It
it.
also was one of the first chapters where I could actually begin to do some oral interviews.
It
Yeah,
is.
and so I did some oral interviews there, and man, to be able to talk to women who were activists in 30s and 40s, it just I knew that I was onto something with that chapter. So that's how all those chapters ultimately came into place. And I will say this very quickly, and I'll be quiet. But as I said before, I've been honored to be invited to go and speak at other places. And one of the first things I often ask them if I get an invitation to come and lecture is, "Are your archives digitized?" And if they are, I'll go and like quickly look through. And do you have student newspapers? Because again, anytime you go through these student newspapers, you find so much rich evidence for how this second curriculum, how this communitas operated within these spaces, right? So, for instance, one of the schools where I got a virtual invitation to speak was at Prairie View. This was during COVID, during the pandemic, and sure enough, their newspapers were digitized. I went through, and it was just so powerful to see young Black men and young Black women in the 1930s in a state like Texas
There you go.
celebrating the fact that Cargie Woodson was coming to campus.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
coming to campus? They were reading the Negro World, which is Marcus Garvey's newspaper.
All right.
Where else are young Black kids being exposed to that in a place like Texas, other than this shelter in a time of storm, like a Prairie View,
That's
right?
right.
Like a
Absolutely.
Texas Southern, right? So yeah, that no matter what the institution, these legacies, these examples, these powerful examples, they exist. And I think it's important. I think that's a charge to, you mentioned, class
Mhm.
that you teach, let your students know that, I mean, there's still so much more in the narratives that we have not yet uncovered, that we need to uncover in order to show how critically important HBCUs have been in American life.
Absolutely. And one of the things we always do, I think a couple weeks ago, actually this year, we visit Moreland Spingarn and actually look and touch the documents because it's so important to understand all the stories that are there. And that, again, as you said, there's so much to be told, but also at each moment in time, there's a different story. I mean, in terms of how we look at it, how we analyze it, what reveals itself to us. I certainly think that's incredibly important, and certainly a Charles. I make the students and will continue to do so. Certainly, your work stands as an example of why that's so very important. The other thing I know I misspoke earlier around the second curriculum, and I want to be clear in terms of what I think in terms of why that's so powerful. Not only in terms of understanding this cultivation of leadership or activism among students, but also what that meant in terms of what that meant for the faculty members and other folks at HBCUs, because oftentimes their influence and their impact isn't really told in a way that helps to understand, how they actually engage their work. And so I think this second curriculum helps to understand what it meant to teach. Even when you talked about from Dr. Nick Nelson, William Nelson, or Beverly Gordon, how important it is sharing those perspectives and doing that mentoring.
Yeah.
That approach is so critical in terms of developing one's sensibility about work or their particular commitment. And so the second curriculum to me also is very important for the students, for the faculty, all the people involved with with the institution,
Yeah.
not only singly but also collectively.
Yeah, Hassan, again, who was my dissertation advisor,
Mhm,
and again, a Morehouse man.
mhm, mhm,
He also was raised in the Baptist tradition, and I'll
mhm.
never forget. He's reading some of my earlier drafts, and he jots a little note in there. It's like laying on of hands,
There you go.
and he's like, this sounds like a laying on of hands with the
There you go.
tradition. Where
I
again,
love it.
I'm a PK kid,
I
and
love it.
I'm a preacher's kid, and
Hmm.
in the Black church we have this tradition of church folks,
Hmm.
church women,
Absolutely.
deacons,
Hmm.
ministers.
Hmm.
Before you go off,
You know that's
we're
right.
gonna pray for you. Right?
Absolutely.
There's a mission and a purpose on your life that we want to funnel through. Right, we want to be a part of lifting you up, laying on His hands, extending this blessing to you as you go off into this hostile world. And I think that is what the heartbeat of the second curriculum
Got
really,
it.
really was. There's this great quote in my chapter on Alabama State University that I use a lot in my lectures, where in 1961 the students write an open letter to the governor of
Hmm.
the state of Governor Patterson, and at this time they are really holding Harper Council Trenholm, who's the president. They're
Hmm.
holding his feet to the fire and really forcing him
Hmm.
to expel students, to fire faculty who Joanne Robinson. I mean, people who are friends of his. Um,
Hmm.
he's being forced and really coerced to let go. And so the students write this letter to Patterson, and in it, again, they call a thing. They say, look, you know, as a historian, as any scholar, you're always looking for smoking gun evidence.
Hmm.
In this letter, they look, our education, our training was for
Hmm.
this particular moment. They literally say it, right?
Yes.
They call him the task for being a hypocrite, right?
Hmm.
And they talk about Christian and democratic values that they've learned within this
Hmm.
space. And then they say the thing that, our training, everything we've learned up to this moment, even under the auspices and guidances of this man that you are exploiting, right? That
Hmm.
you are harming, Harper Council Trenholm,
Hmm.
right? Um, uh, the second curriculum has enabled us, has empowered us to use
Hmm.
our voices
Hmm.
to call out white supremacy and segregation as we find it in this society. So again, to your point, it's deliberate, it's
Hmm.
intentional. Again,
Hmm.
it's not through some form of osmosis. These courses are critically important. These mentors are critically important. The James Weldon Johnson said when he arrived as a student at Atlanta University, I talk about this in the book. He said, "Look, man, race was everywhere. Like we talked about it, right? We wrote essays on it. It was the subject of speeches. We talked about it in the dorm rooms. Our professors talked about it, even in classes that weren't African American history course. I mean, it was in the air, right? Again, he's describing that second curriculum, which again, as I argue in my work, is really comprised of three major things, right? Race consciousness, cultural nationalism, and idealism.
There you go.
The fact that we're going to make sure these Black students have the intellectual tools to counter this tide of white supremacy, which is trying to teach them that not only are they inferior, but
Sure.
they're determined and intended to be second class citizens, right? They got to be able to refute that, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
People like Karji Woodson, who understood the value of
Hmm.
HBCUs as spaces where we could counter these very pernicious messages. And then this notion of idealism, right? Citizenship and democracy constantly showing up in these primary sources. These students were being drilled
That's
in
right.
these ideas of citizenship and democracy. And then this notion of cultural nationalism, right? That
Yeah.
we've got to build Black spaces. We got to
You have to.
build Black organizations. We got to support our Black churches. We got to support our Black businesses. And in doing so, again, it creates a generations
Right.
of race men and race women who are very, very deeply proud
Hmm.
of these spaces that they've maintained, that they've been tasked with serving as custodians over. So that's the type of environment that these institutions were. Again, I'm the head of the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute. I mean, Patterson was a unflinching race man.
That's right. That's
who
right.
understood the power of these spaces. He, of course, was former president at Tuskegee, went on to become the founder of the UNCF.
Right.
One of my favorite photos, which I'm about to get framed and put up here in the office, is a photo of Patterson along with Rosa Parks at
Wow.
the Highlander Folk Training School
Highlander. Oh
in
wow.
1955.
Mhm.
They're sitting together in conversation. He's the president of Tuskegee. She's
Right.
Rosa Parks. And here they are in this space, this very powerful space, talking about the movement and where the movement is going. But more importantly, they're also receiving the training within this
So,
space to equip them,
mhm.
better equip them in the work that they're doing. And then they take that back to their communities. And for Patterson, that would mean, of course, going back to a place like Tuskegee. So yeah, I mean, hats off to our ancestors, hats off to these administrators and these faculty members who understood the value of Black spaces
That's
and
right.
championed Black
And,
spaces.
and also, I think an overarching takeaway is this issue of agency because again this black agency or agency in terms of agency suppressed or agency realized, and so actually seeing models and examples of that is extremely important and naming it as such,
Yes.
because otherwise again it's sort of minimized, the strength and the power of it's minimized or not really acknowledged in all of its fullness. And so I'm wondering, as a sort of closing question, given where we are now, certainly higher education generally, I mean, just all of higher education is really in a state of change, tremendous change, pressure, et cetera. And so, right now, when we think about institutions and their responsibility to their communities and also role in terms of just who we are as a nation and what that means, what higher education means for this nation. When I think about the title of your book, Shelter in the Time of Storm, certainly some could argue that we're in a stormy time right now in higher education, trying to figure out what will the next 50 years or even the 22nd century looks like for us. And I'm just wondering, are there lessons from your work that might help us as we navigate this time?
Well, I'm gonna say this, and I'm gonna pray it doesn't get censored out, Mel.
Okay, okay,
But I'm a historian. I'm a truth teller, and
okay.
we can say
Mhm,
it as it is. Call a thing a thing. And I remember probably about a year ago watching Eddie Glaude
mhm,
on television speak to this issue of higher education officials in many ways retreating from their support of DEI and creating more hostile spaces. And he made a point that, look, we just got in these spaces, right? We just arrived, right? The Black students have been, heavily present in PWIs, prior to 50 or 60 years ago.
mhm.
They literally just returned
Just,
to
mhm,
the space or just
that's
arrived
right.
in
That's
these
right.
spaces.
That's
And
right.
one thing that I think has to be said is that
Mhm,
um, really what we're witnessing
mhm.
is not a retreat, but really we're witnessing in higher education, particularly at PWI, they're reverting back to what they originally have been.
Mhm.
Carter G. Woodson said that there would be no lynching if it was not first taught in the classroom.
There you go.
So white supremacy as an ideology
Hmm.
was in many ways born within
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
they studied they created classes around this. They
Hmm.
studied the inferiority of Black people, right?
Absolutely.
And not only that, but that fueled the policy and the policy makers that would ultimately help to crystallize Jim Crow, to
Hmm.
make sure that white supremacy was deeply embedded systematically
Hmm.
within every walk of American life.
Hmm.
The academy is on hook for that.
Hmm.
And so when we look at and observe what's going on, it's just the academy doing what the academy was founded to do. Now,
Hmm.
I would argue this, that beginning in 1837, we got a radically different model
Hmm.
for how higher education can and should be in the
Hmm.
lives of, particularly in the lives of marginalized people, but in the lives of, or in the broader scheme of American life, right? And that's the HBCU model. And I think that there is so much that we can learn and extrapolate from this
Mhm.
model, which shows that we can combine intentionality, right, as you mentioned,
Mhm.
power specifically. And I need to go back because I didn't really emphasize this enough. Right?
Mhm.
We talk about the second curriculum and it's race consciousness and all these things, right? Let's be clear. There's an intentionality in that as well, is that, this was the humanities, right?
Mhm.
This was social sciences, right? That really gave our students the ability to envision and dream a world
Mhm.
free of
Mhm.
white supremacy and to equip them with intellectual tools
Mhm.
to deconstruct that as they found it. And so, if I think that we can be intentional in our work, but we can't do it without the humanities and social sciences. And I think that across this country, maybe even across this world, particularly in higher education, we're seeing a retreat from these fields. We're seeing them being deliberately gutted and undermined, and we're replacing it with intellectual tools, which we're saying, oh, this will create for you,
Mhm.
this will dream for you,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's a very, very dangerous place to be.
Sure. Sure.
And of course, I'm talking about AI,
Mhm.
and so I'm deeply concerned about what that means for the future. But
Mhm.
I'm also deeply hopeful that if we look at the power and significance of HBCU spaces and how they have often pushed and elevated these humanistic ideals,
Mhm.
which challenged us to study the human condition, and not just to study the human condition, but to elevate the human condition, right? To push inclusivity, to push equity, to push justice. If higher education cannot serve us in that capacity, then it can't serve us at all.
There you go.
I think that's what the HBCU model really illustrates by making sure that, oh, we'll do a first curriculum,
Mhm. Mhm.
we'll teach these
Do
classes,
that. Mhm.
but there has to be a second curriculum
There has to be.
which uplifts and empowers us as humans and brings us together and champions these ideals, which bring forth our better selves. And that's the legacy of HBCUs. And I think that more and more people, I hope that people are beginning to see that. I'm speaking it at Yale next week. Uh,
Mhm.
I think that some of these invitations, I have the opportunity to speak at several other, PWIs. I think PWIs are very, very curious about the HBCU model, because they too see what's going on,
There
and
you
they
go.
they too want an alternative and a model for which to really base their work around, a model that again is going to make sure that all people are included, um, that marginalized people are empowered, and that these intellectual tools that we're providing to our students will bring us closer together as opposed to pushing us further apart. And so I think the humanities and social sciences are a part of that solution, but I also think HBCUs are a part of that solution as well.
I love that. The HBCU model, I think, is extremely powerful, and I agree. Certainly, this emphasis on elevating our humanity. I mean, really, and the value of the humanities and social sciences in doing that. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Chuck McKinney just had a conference at Morehouse, I think last week or the week before last, talking about the literary tradition, right, of HBCUs, and that literary tradition is powerful,
No,
right?
it is absolutely.
Absolutely powerful. One of my next projects, it's called Sacred Spaces Project, where it looks at the history and legacy of HBCU seminary.
Wow.
Where would we be without Virginia Union
There
and
you go.
Howard University and Shaw and Livingstone
That's
and
right. Pain and exactly. List goes on and
Hammond and all these schools that
on.
train ministers not just to go out and talk about prosperity and whatnot, but train them to empower their communities to embrace what James Cone refers to as Black liberation theology, and center that in their work and their research. Black colleges were part of that legacy, and I think that's a very, very powerful narrative to tell. That's one of the research agendas that I'm bringing to the Patterson Institute.
Love
Is,
it.
we're doing, all this work and research on workforce development and enrollment data.
Mhm.
All these things are important. You mentioned these reports that we turn out, but um, one of the things that Michael Lomax mentioned to me is that we turn out these reports every year, but he thinks and I think that there's still so much more of this narrative
Mhm.
we learn from,
Right.
can enlighten us, that can serve as a beacon
Mhm.
in these dark times. And certainly looking at how HBCUs have shaped the moral arc of our nation is a large part of that. So that's one of my next major research initiatives for us moving here, and hopefully it'll come out in a monograph book form down the road.
Wonderful. Well, again, I mean, what a wonderful closing. It's always a pleasure to certainly speak with you, Dr. Favors, and this has been an amazing episode. Again, I'll take a bit of personal privilege. Dr. Favors is truly one of my favorite people on the planet, having known him for nearly 30 years or more, probably. It's right more than 30 years.
Yeah.
But okay, wow.
Yeah.
And I
You
really
dating us, Mel. You're dating
dating
us.
it. There you go. Exactly. Exactly. Well, and again, just to see what his work and how valuable it is, and not only his work, but also his commitment to the work, and really will last for generations. So again, Dr. Favors, thanks so much for being a part of Turning Pages. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all again on our next episode. But again, I'm Melanie Carter, Director of the Center for HBCU Research Leadership and Policy here at Howard University, and we wish you all well. Thanks again, Dr. Favors.
Thank you.